You are listening to the Billy Dees podcast.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. As always, I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked us out before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast. Today, we have an interview for you on the studio line is Andrew Linn. Andrew, welcome. So glad you're here.
Thank you very much for having me, Billy. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Andrew Linn is a documentary filmmaker, and his latest film is Church and State, Roger Williams and the Founding of Freedom of Religion. All right. I kind of feel that this is probably one of the most understood topics. I always hear it incorrectly referenced. Let's start a little bit about you. Where are you from originally?
I grew up in Maryland.
Maryland.
So I grew up there majority of my life, but ended up in West Virginia currently.
Oh, awesome. Well, you're not too far from me. I'm in Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah. So religious background or indifferent, or what's your story?
Yeah, so I was raised secular, but my father was Jewish, my mother Episcopalian, didn't go to church much, never went to synagogue, but I celebrated both holidays, so I got the best of both worlds, Easter, Passover, Christmas, Hanukkah, all that stuff. But I grew up, and when I was about 23, I gave my life to Jesus, and so I've been serving Jesus ever since as best I can. That's my faith background.
Interesting. You know what I find interesting is England, for example, does not have an official separation of church and state. The king is the head of the Church of England. And in the United States, we have what you might call an official separation of church and state. And we seem to have all the problems with getting that confused. It doesn't seem to happen in the United Kingdom that much, or at least I'm not aware of it. Is there a reason why in the United States we always blur those lines?
Yeah, it's a convoluted issue. It's not a black and white issue either. And I think in academia, either at universities or even in public school, we're not really taught our history very well, and the idea of the separation of church and state. It's also in pop culture. I mean, many people have heard the phrase church and state, so they have a cursory level knowledge of what it means, and they think it means freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion as it was intended. So people think that, presidents can't pray, and Christianity isn't allowed in the public square. Meanwhile, I guess every other religion is allowed in the public square.
Yes.
But not Christianity specifically, when that's our foundation as a country. We are not a theocracy, like you mentioned, as, I guess technically England is. We have separation of church and state, but it's, we're foundationally Christian, and it just means freedom of religion. It isn't to get rid of religion. And as a good comparison, there's atheistic communist China, which is a freedom from religion society. And you can have Christianity there, but it has many limits and regulations, and you can be punished, go to jail, all these sorts of things. So that's a good comparison if you want to see freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion, which we have here in America.
Yeah. I've always been told, or at least my own personal interpretation of it, is that in the United States anyway, that separation of church and state actually protects both. It's not necessarily one shielding the other. Is that correct, or am I wrong there?
So the First Amendment says that basically the government cannot establish a federal religion. So we don't have a religion married to the state, which is a good thing. But it also can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. So I guess in a way you're kind of right. Yeah, it's to keep federal government or government out of the church, most importantly, and to protect religion. But it's not necessarily entirely to keep it out of government. Now, again, that's where it gets a little confusing. Like I was saying before, it's not exactly black and white. We have chaplains in Congress. after the First Amendment was ratified, Congress called President George Washington to have a national day of prayer and thanksgiving. So, modern interpretation would say, well, that's a violation of the separation of church and state. Congress can't call a president to pray, and, specifically to a specific God, in particular, Jesus or whomever. So like I said, it's a new idea that they developed for our country because of the persecution that was going on in Europe with all these theocracies. And they weren't, they would persecute Jews sometimes, but they mainly were persecuting Christians who just thought differently than the state-run church over things like baptism and things like that. And that's obviously the famous story why the Pilgrims came here, was to escape religious persecution. But they were actually repeating the error. They established theocracies here that were persecuting people here like Roger Williams, who went on to found Rhode Island. And that was, as far as we know, the first charter or first state in world history to have freedom of religion in its charter.
Yeah. Well, kings had a habit of going to the Pope to get validation on a lot of things. And back then, the power of faith was extremely powerful. I mean, you could, get tried as a heretic.
Yes.
So, going against the king, if he made the comment, well, I'm the king and I say this and God agrees with me, I think that puts you in a lot of danger too.
Right, exactly.
So I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I think the founding fathers saw that enough times and said, okay, we've had enough of that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing, I bring up a brief bit of history in the documentary, exactly to your point, that it was laughable what was going on in England. If you would get a Protestant king, they would persecute Catholics.
Yes.
You get a Catholic king or queen, they would persecute Protestants. So it was this seesaw effect. And it was ridiculous. And these kings and queens weren't the most moral people to be the head of the church.
No.
They're probably the least moral people in society. Maybe not the least, but they had their own issues. So it was hypocritical for them to be deciding judgments on people for being heretics or whatever. So, yeah.
You mentioned Roger Williams. Exactly who was he? Because that's not a name a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah, correct. And that's part of the reason I wanted to make this documentary, was to bring up an unsung hero of the founding of our country. So he was a Puritan, he was a theologian and a politician. He came here with the other Puritans and settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A lot of people may not know this, but the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy. They literally ruled every aspect of your life, the length of your hair. You couldn't be single. You had to live with family. And they would banish people for things as simple as being too proud. If they deemed you were too proud, they would banish you. So while they were fleeing religious persecution, they were sort of repeating the error in that they established new religious persecution, but based on their Puritan beliefs. So anyways, Roger Williams was there. He saw this and he said, hey, guys, this isn't right. He was big on soul liberty, he called it, or liberty of conscience. And he basically pointed out, you can't force people to go to church on Sunday as they were. You're just making hypocrites. Anybody can say whatever they want in front of, if they're forced by sword to do something, doesn't mean that you've converted their heart to Christianity. You've simply changed their behavior for a period of time to have a semblance of civility based on your beliefs. So anyways, he was banished for that, among other reasons, from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were hoping he'd die in an English prison. Fortunately for him, he got away from the authorities. He escaped and went on to found Providence. He bought the land from Narragansett Bay Indians and went on to establish Rhode Island. And then he went back to England to get a charter from the king and establish the colony. And like I said, it was the first, as far as we know in world history, to have freedom of religion in its charter.
Interesting. We hear a lot about the founding fathers. A lot of, I'll say, Christian conservatives claim that they were Christians. People who, progressives will say, no, they minimize their beliefs. They say, no, they weren't. It's hard to know what was in anybody's heart at any given time. My best guess is, I'll say the same thing about Einstein. We don't know exactly what he believed, but generally he did believe in God. However, a personal God, somebody that you could pray to for specific results in your life, was something a little different. That's what we're not too sure about. How would you describe Benjamin Franklin? I don't know what he believed, but he didn't live the life of a Christian too much. What were the beliefs of the founding fathers, generally speaking? Not every single one of them, but I would think that faith at that time was something that was pretty common.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely before the founding fathers who established the country and the Constitution, majority were Christian who came here. There were some that weren't, but I would say 80-90% of people who came here in the colonies were Christian, and the people who established or became governors of the different colonies would be pastors oftentimes. And a lot of people don't know this, but the colonies were religious states. They each had their own denomination. Maryland was Catholic, Virginia was Anglican. So anyway, as we get to people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, they are deists. So they did believe in God, but they also weren't against religion. So, for instance, Benjamin Franklin said that if men be so evil with religion, what would they be without it? So he wasn't against religion. But and I would say the founders themselves, people like George Washington, all those guys in the 1700s, I would say they were Christian by and large, but they were, there were some Freemasons in there and, like I said, a couple deists. So they were religious, I would say. Definitely George Washington was religious, and, John Adams and guys like this. But, it wasn't as solid, I'd say, as when the all the people were escaping religious persecution came here. They were largely, probably, more Christian, I think, than the founders, I'd say. There are people, and I'm a Christian and conservative, and there are people who will say, yeah, like you said, oh, every single founder, they were Christian and they intended us to be a Christian nation. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do believe that we're foundationally Christian. I don't think you could argue that, but I don't think they were, they certainly weren't trying to establish a theocracy. I think you can read some of their writings, particularly Thomas Jefferson and some others that, they wanted the church out of the state because they, like you said, we saw the history, what was going on in Europe for so long. Why keep this going? This is the new world.
Deists is the term that I probably most associate with the founding fathers. So that's absolutely, in my opinion, I agree with you. And I'm here again. I'm not a scholar or by any stretch of the imagination. I'm pretty good with after the Civil War. Pre-Civil War, I'm not so good with. So, we hear a lot about a free society and the freedom of speech, and this often coincides with expressing your religious beliefs and so on. I do agree that I think Christians are unfairly singled out, more so than the other religions when it comes to, we have to tolerate, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but I was raised Catholic. And I think that Christians tolerate a lot that other religions would not. For example, there was the infamous crucifix displayed upside down in a jar of urine that was displayed as a work of art. If you would do that with Muhammad, that would be an entirely different thing. Why is it? Is it because of the fact that Christians do have that turn the other cheek philosophy? Is that why so much of it happens?
I believe so, but I also think it's cultural. We used to have prayer in school and different things like that. And there's been a concerted effort to kind of strip Christianity from America and make it seem like this, like we mentioned earlier, separation church and state means freedom from religion. And really it just means, I think the idea is to focus on Christianity. Enough of this Christianity, get it out of here, get away from us, from the left, people on the left, academia. It's to them the most offensive thing you could say is Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven, among other teachings. Sure. And I think that Christians have bought into it. It's in movies. It's in everything. Oftentimes the Christian or the nice Christian man is actually the devious bad guy in TV shows and movies, and the good guy. I mean, they had that show on Fox. It was about the devil, and he's actually a good guy. Yeah. He's just misunderstood or whatever. So it's stuff like that. I think it's concerted effort, but I think Christians are waking up, and I think they've tolerated stuff long enough where it's like, all right, I think that's enough.
Yeah.
But yeah. And plus, but as you said, the example Christ set, turn the other cheek, carry a cross, die to self. These are all Christian ethics where, it's suffering is part of the program. So.
Yes. Interesting. When it comes to, here again, getting back to that philosophy, I'm not necessarily a religious person. However, I can understand both the good and the bad of what religion can do. And I'll speak about the good for a moment here. Back in here again, I was raised Catholic. And I remember back in the day in the 1970s, you had St. Anthony's. They were the Italian parish, right? And then you had St. Joseph's, and there was a lot of Polish people there. Same with Our Lady of Peace. And what was interesting about these neighborhoods is the religious aspect of it aside. When somebody, let's say, had a death in the family, or there was somebody had a serious illness, these parishes, these churches would rally together to help that person. And okay, if you're listening to this and you don't particularly like religion, you think it's a bad thing, that's fine. But that has disappeared now. That part of our culture has largely disappeared. And what is going to replace it? We have a very lonely existence now. Everybody is, you'll be lucky if you know the neighbors on each side of you now, let alone everybody in the neighborhood, let alone having any sense of community or the fact that people are going to help each other or pray for each other or bring over food when something bad happens. Nothing has replaced that. What aspect of that in terms of religion do you think gets overlooked? I mean, I couldn't imagine a left-leaning commentator pointing that out, but I think it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, well, I believe that I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase cultural Marxism, but I believe we've been under a cultural Marxist attack where the state is supposed to replace the church.
Absolutely.
And technology, as you said, it kind of silos us, isolates us, makes us introverted. I mean, kids these days raised on cell phones, they don't have manners. They don't know how to talk to people. They don't deal with people. They don't want to deal with people. That's why I brought up that even deists who weren't atheists love to bring up that some of our founders were deists. It's like, yeah, but they weren't atheists. Even they valued religion. They knew it was important. They despised the French Revolution because it was an atheistic revolution. They thought it was a holy horror, terrible. And they have many writings, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, writing against the French Revolution and saying that if you get rid of religion, what's the moral foundation for your society? I mean, these are things George Washington said. So, I mean, not exactly the way I phrased it, but so anyways, yes, religion's important. And our founders, again, they weren't trying to get rid of religion or have freedom from religion. And we have cultural Marxists and academia and media pushing anti-Christian things. And, while they elevate one religion, saying, hey, they're not actually all that bad, but these guys, they're the real bad guys because they judge. Yeah. So, judgment, I guess, is far worse than, blowing stuff up. I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, so, yeah, I think that's kind of what's going on.
It's a good answer. And it's spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's nothing to replace it, in my opinion. And everybody is in some way religious. We all have something we worship or lean on, for value and, so, it's just, we all need religion or a God in some sense.
Yes.
So
we all have our own little version of all of us are faced with our eventual mortality. And we're, as far as we know, now there are species in the animal kingdom that know that they're going to die and they go somewhere and die. But in terms of knowing from the early stages of your awareness when you start to become a young child, knowing that day is going to come, as far as we know, is specific to people. And we all have our own little way of dealing with that. And no matter how many ways you want to talk around it, there's 7.5, 8 billion people on Earth. And I always say there's 7.5, 8 billion little religions. We all have our own way of coping with our existence and its eventual demise. So I absolutely agree with that. We all have our way of doing that. I want to talk a little bit about the atheists and the impact on Christians, because there was a time when I would empathize a lot with a lot of the arguments that atheists had in years past, and they were pretty reasonable. But now I'm going to say they've become as cult-like as the people they claim to dislike the most. I don't know how you can be fervent about a belief of the non-existence of something. I always found that was kind of strange. I can understand believing in a God or believing in the Force, from Star Wars or something, but being really fervent about the fact that doesn't exist is something that I've never really, I don't know where the passion comes from. I can understand where the logic comes from. But they've made it so that, like you were talking about with the separation of church and state, that concept was never really aimed at a second grade class having a manger. That is not what that was aimed at. It was aimed at religious policies of one religion being posed on an entire group that may or may not believe those things. Right. How has this radical atheism now, how has it impacted what you're talking about? Because if they had their way, they would make the churches almost go away. In the United States.
Correct. Yeah. No, I actually went on a podcast. I was kind of hoodwinked into it. I didn't realize it was an atheist. He had the title of his podcast was What the Bible Says. And foolishly, I researched 20 minutes before I went on what it was. And I was like, oh, uh-oh. Yeah. So it was all a gotcha interview kind of thing. And I said to the guy, and I've heard this it's not original to me, I've heard this from other people. So it's like, if you don't believe in the God of the Bible, why do you hate him so much, as you were kind of alluding to? Yeah. Like, why are you so bothered that I believe? And he knew the Bible better than me. He was quoting me script. I mean, he had a screen with his scripture, but I'd bring something else. He'd be like, oh yeah, that's Matthew 10 too. I'm like, oh, I don't even remember the exact verse. But it's like, you're so well versed in something you hate and you claim it's not real. I don't get it, but it's ironic that they're just so obsessed. And I asked them, why don't you ever attack Islam? Why is it just Christianity? Why is that your focus?
Yes.
Because that's their main focus. It's like Christianity. And and I agree with you. When I was younger, before I was a Christian, I'd hear some atheists have convincing arguments. And at that time, they were more level-headed. And now they're very, like you said, very, very, I can't say the word, but vitriolic and just nasty.
Yeah.
So, it's just, it's funny. And it's cultural Marxism. I mean, Marxism, socialism, no God, atheism, atheistic governments, right? And like I said, go to China if you want an atheistic government, if you want to try that out. And
Yeah. When we talk about talking about God in public places, should people be able to do that? And especially in regard to politicians. Now, here's my take on it. You tell me if I'm right or wrong, and by all means, elaborate. I don't necessarily have a problem with a politician talking about his Christianity. I really don't have a problem if they are Jewish or anything else talking about their faith. Where I get a little nervous, and I've heard Christian conservatives here lately, when they won elections, they say, well, God spoke in this election today. That makes me just a little nervous. Claiming divine providence in an election is where I get nervous. You want to talk a little bit about that? Should politicians in particular be able to talk about their faith as public figures?
Oh, absolutely. I think yes. Yeah, they should. And so we know who they are, but you have to have discernment. Are they just saying these things to, appease certain people? And I feel, back to the founders, I feel that some of them would say things to as a largely Christian nation. So to be in positions of power, you kind of had to speak Christianese, you know what I mean? Whereas today, every president says they're Christian, right, to run for office, minus, a few.
Yeah.
Christian, Catholic, whatever, and then Mormon with Mitt Romney. But anyways, but that was an unpopular, because they're minority faith in the country. It was, a lot of people were like, oh, he's Mormon, but he got pretty high up, right? He almost
sure
won.
did.
So,
yeah.
But no, I think it's fine. I mean, I understand, like, on a personal level, being like, with some of the things they say, particularly, I'm a Christian and conservative. I watched the Charlie Kirk funeral, but I thought it was very strange, all the leaders of our country getting up and saying these Christian things, which I didn't feel was authentic or true to themselves. I don't particularly see them as religious people.
Sure.
And I thought that was strange. And I think it's strange that we have conservative commentators who, when they were on, large broadcasting platforms, they were just straight political commentators. And now all of a sudden they're Christian religious philosophers and trying to influence society about religion. It's like, I'm glad I don't get my spiritual lessons from, Tucker Carlson or these other people who are, get paid millions of dollars to just cause ruckus online. So, but
100%. I'll ask you about him in a minute. I think it's a simple fact of the matter. You have the Republicans and the religious right, what were called evangelicals back in the day, back when Reagan was president. They have that base that they have to appeal to, just like Democrats have to appeal to, minorities, and they have to say all the right talking points to get those people going. And you don't know if it's sincere or not. You don't know if it's just what they're supposed to do to activate that part of the base. So that there's always, and it's unfortunate because I'm probably one of the few people out there. I would rather have a sincere person than somebody who knows what to say on cue,
Right.
But nonetheless, that's the part and parcel of how we live. Speaking of how we live, I've said this before many times on the show that, getting back to the Reagan years, I was in high school in the early part of the 80s there. And I remember, conservatives and liberals talking back then, but they all had a general philosophy that was a little different, but they all lived in the same universe. They all played by the same rules of physics.
Right.
Even in the 1990s with Clinton and Newt Gingrich, there was still a commonality in how the world worked. Right. Now we're in a situation where, and this applies to political ideologies, it applies to how we think about religion, where people not only have a right to their own opinion, but they have a right to their own reality. And in parallel universes, what's up for us is not up for them. There is no speaking, there's no communicating. Is there still a way to have a civil debate over controversial topics?
It's hard to say. I mean, Charlie Kirk was assassinated for debating people.
Yeah.
Roger Williams was like he was a Charlie Kirk before Charlie Kirk. He, stood his ground on certain beliefs and was banished, and they hoped he would die. He had a different faith than Charlie Kirk, but and he was put to the test, by the way, Roger Williams, when he established Rhode Island, drew in all the unwanted people from around the country because, it was freedom of religion. So Baptists weren't very liked, so they ended up there. Quakers as well. And Quakers, Roger Williams hated. And most people at that time hated the Quakers, the Puritans in particular. And so he had a quick immediate test. These Quakers started coming to his land that he purchased. And are you really going to hold to this freedom of religion thing? And what he would do is he would row literally on a boat 4 hours to debate Quakers. So he did, that's the heart of the American identity is debate and, all this, debate, discuss, not murder, not banish, not whip, not cancel. So I just think I've heard that after the printing press was invented, it created a lot of civil unrest. So maybe with this new technology we're having, it's developing some civil unrest that we got to adapt to because, it's kind of siloing people. But also this is also coming from universities, this kind of just a perpetual teach and public schools. America's evil. America's this. It's a hatred of your own country. So that people who say they love the country are, they're vile. They're more evil than anything. And they're like I said, I believe there's cultural Marxism going on where it's dividing the country where you can't live among each other. But it's really two cultures now. Where, like you said, in the past, even though they, a Democrat and a Republican, they mainly had differences of opinion on economics. Yes. But generally speaking, they loved their country on both sides and wanted the best for the country. They saw slightly different ways about it. Other than that, nowadays it's, you got one side who wants to, in my opinion, take us just so far off the reservoir in terms of American history that it's almost like a cultural war. Yeah. So so how it cools down, I have no idea.
Yeah. I've told a lot of my left-leaning friends that one of the things the Democratic Party did, and the people who are on the left, is like you said, there's no limit. There's no limit to what they want to do morally, ethically, or anything else. Anything goes. No idea is too crazy. And what happens is people looked at this in 2024 and said, well, Trump is kind of crazy, but that crazy I'm not going to take. Right. and they actually, the radical left got Trump elected. And a lot of my Republican friends are upset at that because they want to give him the credit. But in actuality, it was the choice between which side is crazier. And don't get me wrong, there's people on the right where the crazy meter goes into the red, but it's in the red all the time on the left now. There's nothing that's too extreme. There's nothing that won't go. And I've never heard them once say, no, that's a little much. We don't want to go there. They never say that. and like you were saying, there was a time when, it not being tough on crime, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, would cost you an election. Now it's their voting base. It's crazy. I don't know. Maybe that's my opinion. Maybe I'm off, but they do appeal to this idea that there's something wrong with law and order. And here again. Cancel culture. That's something that I blame the left for mostly, although the right has been active in it as well. I'm not big of a cancel culture person. I've gritted my teeth and ate my own words a few times, but I do believe that if you look at like the book 1984, where you had a big brother and that was going to be the government, an oppressive government. That's happening now, but it's not necessarily the government that's doing it, but it's society. We find somebody we don't like. We go after their job. We go after their income. If there's somebody who's on the air, we antagonize all of their sponsors and things. I don't know that. To me, the free market should determine if you just don't like somebody, don't listen to them, and sooner or later, if they don't have a big enough audience, they'll go away. I don't think that you should be proactive when somebody does that. Here's my problem with that. When I say I don't like this person, I'm going to go after their sponsors. I'm making the decision for you. You don't need to listen to this person. That's what I don't like. Is cancel culture compatible with a free society and separation of church and state?
Yeah, so I do believe in freedom of association, as you mentioned. If you don't like something, you don't have to listen to it. Yeah. And you can protest something, like if it's just absolutely something that offends you. But yeah, cancel culture, I don't think is American. I don't think that's compatible with our country. And I would say that it develops. I am a videographer and editor, and I've filmed at universities, and you've heard of the safe spaces and all these things. These people, it's basically, I'm discovering that at least universities now, colleges now, are an extended camp for these rich kids, more or less, where they're not confronted with tough ideas. They're told what to believe, not, how to think. They're told what to think. Yeah. And they're just very immature people. So when their worldview is challenged, because it's a very honestly weak worldview, they're taught, they crumble and they act like children and have temper tantrums. And, they we're developing a culture of whiny little babies who are going to be dependent on government, because not only do their expensive degrees get them no good jobs, and then so that's another thing where they get angry at the system, and they get angry and they become dependent, and it's just so. Yeah, they become this cancel. A lot of it comes from them, and it's a top down taught to them, this cancel culture stuff, and it's mostly from the left. Yeah, and because if we look again with Marxism in China, what did they do? The Cultural Revolution. They were canceling people, for having farms. And then Mao promised them he'd give them the farms, and he didn't do that. He ended up lying on that one, funny enough.
Yes.
So it's not compatible with the West. It's an ugly thing. It's terrible. And, I think the founders would be appalled at what's going on, particularly Roger Williams.
Yeah, I mean, it's really bad in the UK. I mean, you can get in trouble for making a Facebook post or a social media post. It's crazy. We've been talking to Andrew Linn, filmmaker. Church and State, Roger Williams and the Founding of Freedom of Religion is the documentary. First of all, where can people find the documentary?
Yeah, you can watch the documentary at Church and State Doc, DOC, short for documentary, churchandstatedoc.com. There's several platforms you can watch it on, including YouTube. It's free. Please go check it out. Share with your friends. So it's very informative, has tons of history. If you're into documentaries, I think you'd enjoy it, and please share it so people can see, where we came from and help clear up this debate of the separation of church and state and what it really means. Yes, absolutely. And where your social media, where are you active that people can find you there? Facebook, X, just Andrew Linn, Linn. And, I'll have like church and state ads. I'm sure there's 100 other Andrew Linn. So mine would have the promoting of my film type stuff as photos and things. So. Absolutely. Well, it's been great talking to you. You bring up some great points, and it's a subject that needs to be covered because I hear it misquoted on both sides, quite frankly, all the time. So thank you so much for talking to us today, and I'm going to have to look that up for sure. It sounds like an interesting documentary. Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. Absolutely. Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for being on. My name is Billy Dees. You can find the Billy Dees podcast anywhere, and I do mean anywhere you find podcasts. We have over a 10-year history now. So the Billy Dees podcast is very easy to find on your favorite platform. As far as social media goes, I'm going to say my social media home is still X, the former Twitter, only because it's so real time. It's so trending. It just fits right in with podcasting. They kind of go hand in hand, in my opinion. I recently have started a Substack, though, and I'm a very small account. Just started, but started on Substack as well. Almost on the other major social media platforms as well. Thank you very much for listening to the program today, and we will talk to you again very, very soon. I'm Billy Dees and host of the self-titled podcast, The Billy Dees Podcast. We are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast featuring authors and creators talking about their craft, advocates for community issues, and myself and an array of co-hosts discussing current events. There's no partisan ranting and raving going on here, just great content. You can find the Billy Dees Podcast on your favorite platform and on Twitter at Billy Dees. Thank you, and I hope you listen in.